The early going for the Americans and for the British were not very propitious. The Dutch as well. Okay? During the very first days of that Pacific War after December 7th, the Japanese would occupy Singapore. They would defeat the British. They would occupy the Philippines, which was an American possession. They would occupy the Dutch East Indies, where they were receiving about 40% of their oil. They needed that oil to continue the war. Okay? So they occupied these areas. And by the same token, the Americans in the Philippines were not only defeated by the Japanese, but in many ways humiliated by the Japanese. You see over here, okay, this is the Bataan Death March. 76,000 prisoners, it says. About 11,000 of them were Americans. 7,000 of them would die in this 60-mile, 70-mile march that they were forced on. And the way in which they were treated was nothing less than brutal. This wasn't war atrocity stories. This was the real thing. The Japanese beheaded many of them, tossed many of them into the path of oncoming tanks. Many of those American soldiers, and of course the Filipinos who were joining them, died of starvation. This was war in its worst form, okay? And the Americans are not going to forget that. They're going to pay the Japanese back. In fact, I would make the point right now that the war in the Pacific was in many ways a racial war. It became a racial war. The Japanese mistreated the Americans, and the Americans in turn would, they would return the favor. When I was visiting Pearl Harbor a number of years ago, back in 1988, I was toured around Pearl Harbor by a sailor who was there in December of 1941. It's one of the reasons why he was a tour guide. After Pearl Harbor, he was then sent out with many of his fellow sailors into the Pacific, onto some of the island campaigns. And there, among other things, he found American GIs who had been skinned, possibly alive, but literally skinned by the Japanese. And I hardly need tell you that from that point on, he said, we would not take Japanese prisoners alive. In fact, he was crying, literally crying, when he told me that story. It was a very, very bloody war, a very, very difficult way to begin the war.